Hey folks, my name is Ted. It's been a while since we've been on the Business of Cyber show, but I am back and I am excited to talk about NIS2, NIS2. Europe's largest requirement that they put out goes in effect in late October this year. And if you're in the critical asset sectors and you have any of your facilities in Europe, then you know that this is a big talking point. It's a talking point across technical teams. It's a talking point among non-technical teams about really figuring out how do you maximize the overall baseline levels of facilities across Europe. My name is Ted. This is the Business Cyber Series. If this is the first time that you're watching, then you'll understand that the comments, the people, the things, the topics that we talk about are all centered around one core idea. That is the security leaders within the critical sectors don't have enough resources to do their jobs effectively. We're asking a lot of them. They need more time, they need more people, and they need more budget. So what we do here is we talk about the core challenges that these security leaders are facing. And we always try to bring somebody onto the show. Today, I'm going to be joined by a colleague and somebody who knows a ton about this is Allison Lui. Allison, how are you? Great to see you. How have you been?
Hi, Ted. How are you? Happy to be here to join you today.
Absolutely. Well, we're talking about NIS2 or NIS2, right? Why don't you tell the team, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do for our collective team, SecurityGate, and what we hope to accomplish today, and why this was even brought up as a big topic.
Yeah. So I'm the product owner in SecurityGate. I've been working in SecurityGate for over 3 years now. And my main task in here is to help with our industry leaders and clients to accelerate their cybersecurity program and processes. So whether they are the baseline customers or the more mature side of the customer, so they all have their different frameworks or sector-specific directive standards that they're using. So I'm here to help them to understand the gaps and to improve their cybersecurity resilience. And NIS2 is really important because it's mandated in October this year. All the EU members are supposed to transpose their NIS2 standards or directives, to their national standards.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, so for a little bit more for the audience, I'll steal your thunder, but then explain a little bit more. One of the things that you do for the industry is you take these standards, these frameworks, whether they're maturity, whether they're compliance, whether they're customer driven, whether they're ultra configurable, and you take them from documents this big, and what do you do with them?
Yeah, so my job is to really study the documents, to do some research and to understand the actual requirements of the directives. For example, in this case, is the NIS2. So what we did in the platform, for example, is to go to the ENISA website. Basically, it tells you what are the 10 minimum requirements that you need to be compliant for NIS2. For example, supply chain management, right? The risk management of assets, inventory, for example, and also incident report is a huge thing in NIS2 directive. So we have to transform this kind of controls and subcontrols into the platform for people to understand the NIS2 requirements in a more straightforward way. And instead of looking into those 72 pages of directive, you can use the platform to assess in a very easy way, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in other words, folks, Allison is in the business of taking really complex data models and simplifying them, whether that's connecting a requirement to various controls, whether it's connecting controls to threats to risk, whether it's connecting controls to different workflows of recommended remediation. You know, I look up a lot to Allison because whether it's the NIST family, whether it's the ISIS Secure IEC 62443 family, a ton of experience there on how to simplify these really robust standards, frameworks, and requirements. So I'm excited to dive into NIS2 or NIS2. It's funny, different people call it different things depending on where you're at. But to do that, I put a couple slides together to help us drive that conversation. So we're going to be talking, folks, about 5 different functions. We're going to talk about an intro to NIS, key objectives, implementation challenges, how to really drive compliance, and then finally we're going to finish up with kind of some of the benefits. And I'm going to try to challenge ourselves and our thought process about it, and have Allison really help us, talk through the nuances. As always, if you're watching live, you can comment directly, you can ask a question directly, and we hope to drive that collaboration. But without that, let's spend the next 20 to 30 minutes diving in. Give us a brief introduction, Allison, of the directive itself. Where did it come from? Why does it exist? Just for any of the folks out there that don't know about NIS2 or NIS2, give us a little bit of an overview, Allison.
Yeah. So there is a NIS1 directive before the NIS2. It was basically came into force in 2016. And now we have the NIS2, which is basically need to be compliant. The member states need to be compliant to the NIS2 directive in October this year to transpose their into the law, basically. So the key differences and why we have the NIS2 now is because NIS2 is supposed to address the shortcomings of the NIS directive in 2016. And also we have a deadline and it's mandated, and there is a non-compliance fines and penalties if you're not compliant to the NIS2 directive. So it is a huge deal to be compliant to NIS2. And talking about the maybe a little background and introduction to the overarching goal of the NIS2 as well, it is to raise the cybersecurity baseline across the EU member states, and to also enhance the cyber resilience, and to help the member states to plan the resources, and to have an effective incident response to cyber threats, to avoid this disruption to the operation side and the economy and the society.
We see it all the time. I like the idea of, I think the exact language you used and the exact language in the requirement is raise the baseline cybersecurity resilience. So breaking that down, I think the word baseline, I think, is a strong one in critical infrastructure, because unlike some of the non-critical sectors, or even some of the unique banking and finance parts of the sectors, not every critical sector, chemical plant, water facility, transportation, housing, or pipeline is all considered the same level of equality or criticality for these organizations. So what I'm really interested to see about the deployment in October of this is how effectively these organizations are able to raise their entire baseline. What we've seen in the United States specifically over the course of the last decade or so is a lot of the cybersecurity resources are being placed on what are the big moneymaker facilities, the bigger criticality. Do you feel that the requirement for NIS2 makes a more holistic requirement that all the different facilities for the organizations of the critical sectors have to apply more cyber resources?
Yes, definitely. And it comes to the challenges part, right? That these organizations, they are already complying probably to the sector specific frameworks or standards already. And now you have, on top of that, you also have a NIS2 directive that you need to be compliant to. Basically, how do they gonna merge the two or frameworks together, or the directives together into one, cyber standard, right? So that's one of the challenges that I see for the different industries. But it does provide a more harmonized cybersecurity requirements, I would say, for all the entities. Now that they're
Right.
covering a lot more entities than the previous NIS directive.
And entity is a word that I know you and I use a lot in our world, but for those that don't understand what an entity is, how is it defined by the NIS2?
Yeah, it's defined by the essential entities and the important entities. For example, essential entities would be, for example, the transportation, the healthcare, the digital information, the banking industries. These are all the essential entities that did not cover in the NIS1 directive, and now they are covered in NIS2. So that's why it came to, it's more challenging for them to be compliant for NIS2.
Yeah, I understand. You know, I was actually, so this is a standard right here for those of you who have not read it, okay? 100 pages or so, and it's broken up. It's talk about NIS2 comparatively to, let's say, an SCSF, right? An SCSF, series of standards, series of guidelines, series of shalls or should haves, right? And most standards are like that. NIS2 is different. It's a requirement filled with different articles. Can you explain that a little bit to the audience?
Yeah, so in NIS2, we focus on the 21 article 21.2, to be specific. So there are 10 requirements or minimum requirements that you're supposed to start first. Doesn't matter if you are, which country you're in or which sector you're in. So for example, you're supposed to be compliant to the policies on risk analysis and risk assessment, incident handling, and also reporting. Business continuity, for example, supply chain, and also vulnerability management, assets management. And these are all the domains that we also see in other frameworks like CSF that you mentioned. So there are definitely alignments and mappings between the NIS2 and other frameworks, other common frameworks like ISO, CSF, or IEC standards.
Yeah, I mean, when it's got mappings to ISO 27000, it's got mappings to ISO IEC 62443. I think it has it in the CSF as well. But correct me if I'm wrong, when you grab this 100-page requirement, there's not going to be a prescribed list of every single control that you have to meet. It looks, the way that I like to look at it is it's broken up into 10 requirements. Those requirements we'll go over in more detail, but when you think about the actual regulated component, it's only 10 what I consider family of controls. And so do you believe that to master NIS2 at a given asset owner organization, you're going to have to use either your own brain power, your own guidance, your own framework, or you're going to have to go to another organization as well?
Yes, right. So you need to probably do a mappings yourself to your existing frameworks that you have as a baseline. Let's say that, okay, I have assets inventory in my CSF and I can use it the same domain for my NIS2, right? And also with the help of the NISA tool, that you can look for your fundamental domains that you need to be compliant based on your sectors. So definitely some analysis that our, customers or industry organizations need to do some developing work for the NIS2.
Well, and I think, we're just taking some looks at some notes that we made, like 7 objectives of the actual requirement. We've got strengthen the cyber resilience, broaden the scope and coverage, improve incident response and supervision, enhance supply chain security, promote harmonization and cooperation, enforcement and accountability, and national strategies. To me, I see these as extremely strategic in nature. I think what the organization has tried to do is they're trying to harmonize across all of Europe, enabling folks to bring their own standard to bear. And they've chosen within these objectives 10 different control families that they say you must be addressing. Do you feel that that's kind of the intent of NIS2 and how they've deployed it, Allison?
Right. That's right. That's totally right. And the objectives that you mentioned, these objectives are very specific, telling the people that, the entities, the important and the essential entities, that they need to really focus on these objectives. For example, like strengthen the cyber resilience, right? It tells you that you need to detect, that you need to have a plan to respond to the incidents, cyber incidents. And then for another example is the non-compliant side of it, right? That is specified the penalties and the fines for the essential entities. Is specified the exact amount, basically saying that, okay, 10 million of fines and 2% of the global annual turnover that you need to, that would be the penalties for essential entities. So these are
when we take a look, when we take a look at these implementation challenges, I mean, there's no doubt there's a resource challenge. Some of these industries just don't have as much extra cash at the P&L for every one of these facilities. But if we think about one of the expanded components of NIS2 is that it's associating a higher baseline across all your facilities. So I think that's challenging. The second that we talked about is just a stricter requirement where you can actually be penalized. And then incident response or the incident reporting. You know, we see with the SEC recently, at least for publicly owned companies in the United States, incident reporting is still a little fuzzy. People are watching who's having to report what. Do we know anything about NIS2 and how the reporting structure or the minimum requirements are going to be passed down?
Yeah, so it's different for the different requirements for essential entities and important entities, for example. In general, though, for within 24 hours of the incident happened, you need to actually give an early warning to the relevant authorities. And within 72 hours of time frame, you need to provide a detailed incident report to the relevant authorities as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that'll push back on the timeline there because it's somewhat nebulous. What I found interesting was in the directive, it outlines pretty specifically that any organization at any time can be audited for any particular reason. To me, it seems like Europe has done a really good job at being able to encapsulate the essence of this is happening. You've got to start deploying some resources because we can come check at any time. And if we find you not compliant, we can fine you. That's a different kind of directive that we've seen before, even here in the United States. And it really, it leads to kind of the, go ahead.
The readiness of the organization and the continuous compliant part is really important for NIS2. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if we dive into the compliance requirements, right, we've got, they can fine you. They can actually shut down operations that we know of. There's obviously reputational damage, remedial actions that they can take. There's legal damages and things. But when we actually think about, do we know yet how a given organization needs to showcase their alignment with the requirements? Is that been prescribed yet? Or is it still open to interpretation at this time?
It's very loosely defined, I would say. The requirements are pretty fundamental. As I mentioned before, there are, a few requirements that you must comply to, but the controls and actual technical aspects of the requirements are very loosely defined, and the sectors and also the countries, they need to work together to come up with the NIS2 directive and show the NISA and the EU level that, okay, this is my standard that I did my internal audit already, that I need to show the EU level that I'm complying with the NIS2. So there are a lot of cooperations and information sharing between the country level and also, to the granular level of the entities, right? So a lot of working together, that kind of process happening across the EU, I would say.
So diving into the directive a little bit, what I find interesting about this directive, it's all-encompassing, it's very strong, it has a ton of support from Parliament, European Union, tons of different countries. You can make small changes to the directive according to your country requirements. There's a ton of momentum right now with, I think, not only European-based companies especially, but also US-based companies with or companies that are based virtually anywhere in the world, but they have facilities inside of Europe. Let's talk about the requirements. So breaking down this 100-page directive, most of it is broken up into articles. We have articles on, just to give you a couple examples, I'm looking through all of them trying to find a new chapter. We have article on a scope. We have article on essential and important entities and what they define as entities. We have sector-specific legal actions they can take. Well, we find a lot in the directive about kind of the who and the why. What I was surprised to find over the course of the last year, you and I both know this, is how minimal guidance they've applied to the what. It's not
Right.
good or bad. I think in some cases, if you don't have a very defined list of you shall do this,
Correct.
then it works in the asset owner's favor because they can kind of develop their own techniques. But in the absence of such, it also becomes somewhat hard, especially for smaller organizations that may not have a robust cyber program. Help us understand how the requirements are laid out and how big of a piece of the actual directive those requirements are.
Yeah, it's mainly really around the Article 21 that specify the high level 10 domains or control families that you mentioned, right? So it's really not in details, even though I mentioned before that it tells you the fines, the penalties, all the legal requirements of the NIS2 directive, right? And the levels of the EU and who you're reporting to. Is it going to be the authorities? Is it going to be the council level, right? But then it doesn't really tell you the actual implementation part, I think, that similar to, for example, like a CSF, that it would actually tell you the implementation examples in CSF 2.0, for example. It doesn't tell you that's to the granular level of technical requirements. So that's another challenge, I would say, for people to implement the NIS2.
So let's just dive into that point.
Mm-hmm.
When you compare the most updated version of NIS-CSF compared to NIS2, NIS2 is giving you 10 different requirements, whereas the NIS-CSF is giving you actual guidance on exactly what to do. Can you dive in a little bit more for the audience on the differences there and what they can expect with NIS2 comparatively to other standards?
Yeah, so I'm sure that NISA or the relevant organizations are working for the mappings of NIS2 to other industrial standards, for example, CSF. But I haven't seen a lot of mappings are available already out there, and it takes some time to do some digging, right, into the mappings. And CSF, it doesn't really focus on the legal part of it, because obviously it is a framework, it is not mandatory, versus the directive is a mandatory requirement. CSF would actually tell you that these are the actual controls that you need to do or implement to be compliant to the framework.
Yeah, so like NIS-CSF is putting everything into what we call domains or control families.
Correct.
You know, it seems like their requirements, if we go down, I mean, there's 10 of them. And we're talking about Article 21 within the NIS2 standard.
Correct.
I'm sorry.
It's straightforward too for CSF. It's very straightforward and it's available out there. If you Google just NIST websites, right, it got a bunch of references for CSF and to other frameworks. Informations are really easy to find. Even the methodology of CSF is very clearly defined on how you assess a CSF assessment, whether it is your profile, your implementation tiers, all that stuff is very clearly defined, versus in NIS2 that the documents that you have in hand, it's just a bunch of articles that it doesn't really tell you what to do, to your point, like what shall I do to be really compliant to NIS2 when it comes to audit, right? That how do I tell what evidences and artifacts that I need to be prepared to show that I'm compliant. So that part is, I think, is pretty much missing. And different sectors do, obviously, that I mentioned before, they have different fundamental requirements that they need to be compliant to. So even though NIS2 is trying to harmonize the cybersecurities across the EU, but I'm still seeing some inconsistencies between countries or sectors.
You bring up a good point. I mean, if you pull up NIS-CSF 2.0, you've got govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? You got your families. But it will actually tell you that for a risk management strategy, it'll tell you exactly what has to be in place. And what I find most interesting about framework or standards is they'll actually give you the sub-controls underneath. That's how many cybersecurity strategies are developed, is because we've got to solve a specific control or a sub-control, or we have to put in some sort of compensating control if we're not going to put that in place. NIS2 doesn't have that, right?
No.
So we have 10 in Article 21, we have measures, and those measures give the asset owner a lot of freedom to deploy the resources that they think are necessary based on the criticality of that organization. So on behalf of asset owners that are mature, as well as asset owners that aren't mature, I understand conceptually what the organization that wrote this is trying to do. They're
Correct.
trying to offer a minimal set of guidelines that should be implemented at the level the asset owner believes is necessary by their own risk management practice. And I did find some language inside of Article 21 pretty interesting. Allow me to lay it out. Taking into the account the state of the art and, where applicable, relevant European and international standards, as well as A, the cost of implementation, B, the measures referred to in the previous paragraph, which basically said you had to implement all these, shall ensure a level of security of network and information systems appropriate to the risks posed. That's a really long and in-depth way of saying you can deploy these measures to a degree that you find adequate based on your analysis of the risk proposed. So when we start thinking about risks, we're talking about what's the likelihood, what's the controls base, what's the threats, what's the outcome. You know, in its core, NIS2 is pushing a risk methodology with a prescribed 10 control families that you have to minimally cover. And I think that that's a very big lift, Allison, for a lot of organizations globally that haven't implemented a risk-based assessment or a risk-based compliance program yet. So I could argue both sides. As it relates to our viewers and our readers, how do you master NIS2? I would say, according to Article 21, you got to get really well positioned to defend your position that all 10 of these requirements are in place. But you also have to do risk assessments that incorporate some really holistic thinking about your business. And I don't think all of Europe is ready to do that. I know the globe isn't. Your thoughts before we go over these 10?
Yeah, you're totally right. It's a lot of resources that you need to allocate to develop that NIS2 requirements in your sector or organization. I agree with that. Not just the mappings, the technical side of it, also the communication with different stakeholders, right? Let's say that you have some field members that they have never done NIS2 before, and now you're introducing new areas of cybersecurity like supply chain management, all that incidents report, that strict requirements of the incident report that do not even probably have the mechanisms to support the detection and the reporting of the incident report yet. So I would say that they need to be also well prepared and equipped with the mechanisms, the actual technical side of it to support the requirements, right?
I understand. So let's just go over the requirements real quick. We've got policies on risk analysis and information security. We've got incident handling, business continuity, including backup management, disaster and crisis management. We got supply chain security, including security-related aspects concerning the relationships between each entity and its direct suppliers or service providers. We'll get back to that one in a second. Security in network and information systems, acquisition, development, maintenance, including vulnerability handling and disclosure. Policies and procedures on the effectiveness of a risk management program. Basic hygiene practices and cyber training. Policies and procedures on, looks like, encryption. Human resources security, access control, and asset management. That's a huge one. And then multi-factor authentication. We could dive into any one of these and spend an hour on the various controls necessary. But I wanted to pick one that they actually mapped out, and that's supply chain security. I think supply chain security globally is still not under cybersecurity control. I think it's still a supply chain function, and cyber overlays on top of existing questionnaires, existing analysis that suppliers have to meet. Part of that is their quality management process. Part of that is their overall financial positioning. Part of it is their risk management practices. Now we're laying cybersecurity over that. What I found very interesting in Article 21 of NIS2 is this specific communication in Section 3 of Article 21, that the member states shall ensure that they are taking into the account the vulnerabilities specific to each direct supplier or service provider, and that the overall quality of products and cyber practices of their suppliers and service providers, including secure development procedures. If that isn't a call out for a huge body of work, then I think most people might mistake that. That doesn't mean NIS2 is not saying, hey, make sure you do some sort of cyber assessment of your suppliers. It's not saying you need to check your suppliers' websites. It's not saying you need to check your suppliers' alignment to NIS-CSF. It's asking you to evaluate on a continual basis the company's capacity to have a secure development lifecycle. That is a different kind of requirement. Have you seen anything out there that pushes back on this clause, or any sort of specific guidance that NIS2 is offering beyond what they've said?
Not really. Supply chain is, we are seeing supply chain being a very common and important domain as a whole for a lot of frameworks recently, actually, for the past 2 years, actually. Even in other frameworks like AES-CSF, or, they actually change the language of, combining the vendors and the third parties and supply chain all together into one huge categories. That I wouldn't be surprised that NIS2 is mentioning that supply chain, because that affects your internal operations, and also your society, basically. Let's say that if you're in a critical infrastructure, your supply chain is affected, then obviously your supply to your customers as a whole, your economy, will be affected as well. So but you're right, the supply chain is a huge factor in NIS2 directive.
Right. So I want to cover one other point, which is most frameworks, most standards, they will offer should or shall statements, and it's lengthy. Sometimes in the back, there's an annex. In this case, it's an article. It's written in a paragraph form, and it's just 10 requirements. What actions and what steps did you take to deepen the understanding that of the critical controls that an asset owner has to meet? I mean, you're in the business of taking these standards and developing modules that scale out in the form of questionnaires. What did you do when it came to talking with European clients out there on the best way to attack making sure these 10 requirements are in place? Who did you talk to, and what was that process like?
Yeah, I talked to a couple of the clients that they mentioned that, that they did actually give some opinions on the NIS2 directive, and they were saying that is the directions and the guidance is actually not very clear that they were given to how to implement the NIS2 directive. And they think that starting off with the 10 minimum requirements, which are also mentioned in the white paper of NIS2, would be a good start off for them to start communication to their stakeholders and to the bottom level of the fields and sites level, right? So that they kind of saying that, hey, even though they are not so sure what to do, but just by doing the 10 requirements or minimum requirements and mapping to other frameworks, like let's say ISO and CSF, would be very helpful for them to fine-tune their model in a later phase, maybe.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And so one of the agencies or the groups that I see constantly throughout NIS2 is ENISA, ANISA. Can you explain to the audience your work with them, what you've been able to find, and your research to implement more sub-controls underneath these resources, or these
Yes.
requirements, rather?
So there are different tools in the NISA websites that you're able to find, and one of them is specifically for the NIS directive. That has a bunch of controls like incident reports, right? It is a huge thing in NIS2, that they have the control level and the sub-controls level, which is the actual requirements that we map to the NIS2 requirements, the 10 requirements. So my comment to that is it's pretty hard to find. The information is not like available out there on your front page of NISA, and you really have to dig into it, the website, right, to find that and do your analysis yourself. And I was hoping that there are more articles and guidance that tells you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and what to do to map these requirements together.
So in your module that you built, how many controls do you have that map underneath these 10 requirements, right?
29
20.
controls, yes.
And when you compare that to a NIST CSF, how many different controls and questions are mapped in there?
Yeah, so a lot of them, I would say almost 90% are aligned to CSF
Right.
framework. So basically the process is to look at those 29 controls in NISA and be able to map those 29 controls back to the 10 domains in the NIS2 and be able to provide our audience that, hey, you know, these are the 29 controls that we found from NISA, and these are the 70-something requirements that you need to assess for the NIS2. So it's not a lot of requirements compared to NIS 853 that you have over 300 of the controls in NIS 853, right? And also CSF, in terms of CSF, there are over 100 requirements. So we're trying to provide a more straightforward and easy to assess NIS2 framework for our audience, our users, so they can conduct a kind of like an initial gap analysis of their current status compared to the NIS2 minimum requirements. So we're not trying to make it super comprehensive and complicated to start off.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And it seems like what you've done is you've taken 10 requirements from Article 21 of NIS2, and you've mapped those to some other agencies' 29 top controls, the NISA, which has been well used since the first iteration of NIS was released.
Correct.
And really offer back to the asset owners the most simplified yet in-depth capacity to say, yes, we do have that requirement in place. Yes, we do have that requirement in place. It's going to be very interesting to see how most of these European facilities or these entities are communicating their overall compliance to NIS2. But it does appear with the 29 controls that you've been able to find mapped to those 10 requirements, you're positioning these companies to do well in iteration 1.
Correct. That's
I
right.
do feel that NIS2 as a directive is very prescriptive, how we're all going to work together, how we're all going to talk together, how do you define things, but it's not that prescriptive on what do you need to go and do. Whereas other different standards and frameworks that are out there are extremely prescriptive on the host of different things that have to be accomplished, but it lacks the directive in nature. So I think that across the globe, to be successful with NIS2, I would actually argue you should have a very well thought out, well established understanding of other control-based frameworks and standards so that you know how to implement those different controls so that you can meet the overall requirements outlined by NIS2. I think that you can't do one without the other. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, totally agree with you, Tad. Looking forward to look into the next phase of the development of the NIS2 framework, and hopefully they will produce more mappings and guidance references of the NIS2 the technical parts is the one that I'm really looking forward to see, to hopefully help our entities, right? Whether it is important entities, our clients, to implement these requirements in a more simple way, not in a very because people are scared of it. Almost people are feeling like I do not want to do this because where do I even start with the NIS2 framework? Which controls should I even start off first, right? How do I weight these controls? Which one is more important? So these are all the questions that we have, and basically we look forward to see more feedback as well from our customers to see how they're doing it, because each organization might do it differently. They are using different frameworks. They have a different cyber security process. The risk assessment process is very different. So looking forward to see that happening.
Yeah, and on behalf of the industry, we appreciate what you do, which is deepening the understanding of how do I meet that requirement, whether I'm using 62443, ISO 27000, or NIST CSF, and the work that you've done to create those sub-mappings is pretty important. Thank you for coming on the show, Allison. I think that NIS2, to master it, you have to spend a little bit more time on a controls-based gap assessment framework or standard to really understand the sub-controls that you have to choose from to meet those requirements. I think NIS2 does a great job of outlining what the directive is, but it gives a lot of room for interpretation on how am I going to map my specific controls to these requirements, and how many resources am I going to place on these requirements based on what they outline is a review of the risks that's posed to those critical facilities. As always, I think that the leadership has done a pretty incredible job with developing NIS2. Take it from me, anybody that is writing a standard out there, it's a really tough job. It's an entrepreneurial job. You have to create a vision. You have to create a series of standards that people are going to follow, but you can't make it so conflicting or so expensive or so arduous that adoption is not achievable. So my hat's off to the team that has developed NIS2, and on behalf of the industry, we look forward to seeing this implemented. Appreciate what you're doing for the industry, Allison, and stay tuned for more information as potentially version 3 kicks off in the next couple of years. With that, we want to thank you for joining the Business of Cyber show. Join us live next week on July 2nd, where we'll be talking to an asset owner about some pretty interesting stuff. My name is Ted. Go out there and make it a great day in the OT and the critical sector environments. Thanks for joining.